In 1965, a young chemist turned semiconductor executive sat down and did something quietly dangerous. He made a public prediction about a brand new industry. Not the foggy sort of prediction that simply sighs, technology is moving fast, and then retreats behind a cloud of importance. No, this one had numbers in it. Actual numbers. The kind that make engineers lean in and investors reach for a pencil. He looked at the early integrated circuits coming out of Fairchild Semiconductor, and he argued that the number of components that could be packed onto a chip economically was going to keep rising at a steady, relentless rate. He published the idea in a trade magazine called Electronics. The article reads like a field report from the frontier, part observation, part forecast, part challenge to the men building the frontier itself. Welcome to Insights into History, Season 2, Episode 4, The Prophet of Silicon Valley. Decades later, the world would call that forecast Moore's Law, as though Gordon Moore had wandered into the California sun and discovered, beneath the dust and silicon, one of the hidden commandments of the universe. But that framing is a little too mystical for the man himself. Moore's original 1965 article in Electronics wasn't presented as magic. It was a projection, a trend line drawn from observed manufacturing progress in integrated circuits. In that article, he argued that the complexity of chips at minimum cost had been rising at about a factor of 2 per year, and he expected that pace to continue for at least a decade. 10 years later, he revised the cadence to roughly every 2 years. So the idea became famous precisely because it behaved less like prophecy than like a target the industry kept choosing for. That distinction matters. Moore wasn't telling people to stand back and admire destiny. He was describing an engineering rhythm that companies could organize themselves around that included research, manufacturing, lithography, design, cost control, and yield improvement. In hindsight, that's part of what made Moore's Law so powerful. It was not just an observation about chips. It became a management principle for the semiconductor business. The Computer History Museum explicitly notes that the forecast evolved into a guiding principle for the industry, and Intel still describes it as the observation that drove decades of semiconductor planning. If you've ever wondered why modern life seems to run on an invisible countdown timer like faster phones, smaller sensors, and cheaper computation, this is where one of the timer's first famous ticks was heard. Moore's 1965 article did more than predict denser chips. It also sketched a world that sounds startlingly familiar now: more powerful computers, portable communications equipment, and electronics embedded into everyday systems. What later generations experienced as the normal acceleration of digital life was, in part, the long echo of that forecast becoming an industry habit. The reason most people know the phrase better than the person is simple enough. The idea traveled farther than the man. Gordon Moore co-founded Intel and helped shape the semiconductor industry, but his public image never became theatrical in the way later Silicon Valley figures did. Even when profiles celebrate his importance, they tend to emphasize that he's known most widely for the 1965 article and the prediction attached to it. His most famous contribution to popular consciousness was not a speech or a memoir, nor was it a cult of personality. It was a sentence about transistor density and cost. That helps explain why he can feel strangely absent from his own legend. Moore's Law became a slogan, then a yardstick, then something close to mythology. In time, people began speaking of it as though it were an eternal force rather than a human forecast made inside a specific industrial moment. But the historical record points back to something more grounded, more human, and perhaps more impressive. A chemist and executive looking at data, seeing a pattern and articulating it clearly enough that an entire industry began treating the forecast as both challenge and discipline. If Moore sometimes disappears behind Moore's Law, that may be because the culture prefers profits to operators. Gordon Moore was, by most accounts, the latter. He was comparatively quiet, intensely practical, and more comfortable with graphs than grandstanding. The world remembers the law because the law became a story about progress itself. But behind that myth was a person who framed progress not as magic, but as something you could measure, aim at, and, if you were disciplined enough, kept making real. Moore grew up in coastal Northern California, though the geography looks inevitable only in retrospect. He was born in San Francisco in 1929, then spent his first decade in the small farming town of Pescadero, and later moved with his family to Redwood City, where his father was a deputy sheriff. The setting matters because it places him inside the Peninsula world that would later be mythologized as Silicon Valley. But the later outcome wasn't destiny. It was a chain of choices, opportunities, institutions, and accidents that only appears smooth after the fact, history's favorite trick and one of its most persuasive. Moore's path wasn't future computer visionary in any neat modern sense. He trained in chemistry at San Jose State and UC Berkeley, then earned a PhD in physical chemistry at Caltech, specializing in experimental work that demanded precision, measurement, and control over difficult materials. That background isn't a side note. It helps explain why Moore fit the semiconductor age so well. The early revolution in chips was not only about circuits sketched elegantly on paper. It was about materials science, contamination, diffusion, yield, and process discipline. The stubborn business of getting devices to work over and over again, not just once, not just consistently, and not just on a chalkboard that never had to meet a shipping deadline. The key to Moore's world is that it ran on what you could manufacture reliably, not only what you could imagine. The semiconductor business was born in theory, yes, but it survived on furnaces, purity, repeatability, and the miserable little details that decide whether a brilliant concept becomes a product or a dead end. Later industry observers would describe semiconductors as a continuous process chemical industry, which is exactly the sort of lens a physical chemist would naturally understand. It's not glamorous nor is it plumbing until the water stops. History has always had a soft spot for the unglamorous thing that turns out to matter most. When Moore joined William Shockley's new semiconductor lab in 1956, he didn't arrive as a fully formed chip expert. In his own oral history, he said it plainly, "When I got to Shockley Labs, I didn't know anything about semiconductors, really." He added the more revealing point, almost nobody knew much, because the field itself was still so young. He was, by training, a physical chemist. Shockley wanted a chemist because chemistry had mattered at Bell Labs, and the work in California required exactly that sort of experimental, process-minded intelligence. That's what makes the period so important. This was an industry inventing its own playbook while the game was already in progress. Equipment often had to be improvised or adapted. Materials were difficult. Processes were exploratory. In Moore's own telling, they were learning as they worked, repeating earlier experiments, and then pushing beyond them. That's a very different picture from the later mythology of Silicon Valley as a place where brilliance alone changes the world. In the 1950s semiconductor business, brilliance without process was just expensive confusion, an elegant theory with a budget problem. It also taught Moore something that would echo through the rest of his career. Great technical work can be strangled by bad leadership. The Shockley lab became legendary not only because of who worked there, but because of how badly it was managed. Contemporary recollections describe Shockley as increasingly rigid, authoritarian, and fixated on priorities many of his own staff thought were commercially wrong. Moore himself recalled writing a strong memo with Robert Noyce arguing that Shockley should stay focused on the transistor rather than divert attention to the 4-layer diode, and got nowhere. The lesson was brutal and practical. Genius isn't a business plan. People sometimes tell Moore's story as though it were only about forecasting the future. It was also about learning what kind of organization makes technical progress possible. The collapse of Shockley's leadership helped drive the break that produced Fairchild Semiconductor, and from there much of the modern Valley's culture of spin-offs, reinvention, and technically led company building begins to take recognizable shape. Moore was not merely present for that transition. He was one of the people who learned, firsthand, that a company can have Nobel-level intellect at the top and still fail operationally if priorities are chaotic and trust is broken. To understand why that lesson mattered so much, picture the larger American backdrop. This is the post. World War II United States. Cold War urgency. defense spending, missile systems, communications needs, and an escalating demand for electronics that were smaller, more reliable, and mass-producible. The Computer History Museum notes that government spending increasingly flowed into the Bay Area as the United States projected military and commercial power into the Pacific. While PBS's history of Silicon Valley ties the early semiconductor push directly to the need for more heat-resistant, reliable electronics. The transistor opened the door. Integrated circuits and microprocessors would later blow it off the hinges. In the 1950s and early 1960s, that future was still contingent, still fragile, still waiting for enough people to make it real. Silicon Valley itself wasn't yet a global noun. What existed instead was an emerging ecosystem of labs, federal money, skilled scientists, venture formation, and institutions clustered around places like Stanford and the Peninsula Industrial Corridor. Stanford itself now openly describes the university as lying at the heart of the innovation ecosystem that grew around it. But again, none of that was automatic. The region became what it became because research capacity, defense demand, manufacturing skill, and entrepreneurial finance all reinforced one another over time. Underneath all of it was the same hard, unglamorous truth Moore never really lost sight of. If you cannot manufacture it consistently, it doesn't matter how elegant it is. That's why Moore's later reputation as a prophet can be misleading. He wasn't only forecasting what chips could become. He was part of building the organizations and manufacturing culture that could actually ship them. His gift was not just seeing the curve. It was understanding that the curve only mattered if somebody could make real products at scale, with repeatable processes, acceptable yields, and disciplined execution. That's where the scientific and the practical met, where Gordon Moore was most at home. In 1957, Gordon Moore was one of 8 young engineers who walked out of William Shockley's semiconductor lab in California's Santa Clara Valley. Later generations would remember them with the melodramatic label, the Traitorous 8. The phrase endured because it's catchy, because history has always appreciated a title with a bit of vinegar in it, and because nothing helps a legend along like a nickname that sounds as though it came preloaded with thunder. Even contemporary historical treatments make clear that the nickname reflects Shockley's sense of betrayal more than any objective judgment about the split. What actually happened was more practical. A group of highly capable engineers decided that Shockley's management made good work and a healthy company hard to sustain. The break is often told as pure personality drama, genius founder, rebellious protégés, dramatic exit. But the deeper story is about how early Silicon Valley learned one of its core lessons: technical brilliance does not cancel out poor leadership. Shockley was a Nobel-winning physicist and a central figure in transistor history, yet the engineers around him concluded that brilliance at the top wasn't enough. They needed a place where decision-making, priorities, and product direction lined up with the work they were actually trying to do. That's a very different story from young hotshots turn on a master. Reality is more along the lines of talent walked because the operating environment had become unworkable. The walkout did more than produce a feud. It produced a company. In September 1957, the 8 resigned, and very quickly they secured backing from Fairchild Camera and Instrument, forming Fairchild Semiconductor. The speed of that transition is one of the most revealing parts of the story. They weren't just brilliant engineers wandering into the wilderness and hoping that destiny might offer them office space. They had enough credibility, enough connections, and enough trusted intermediaries that capital moved toward them fast. That's one reason the episode matters so much in Silicon Valley history. It shows that the Valley was becoming a place where money increasingly followed people with proven technical judgment, not just formal institutions or rigid corporate ladders. Fairchild mattered for at least 2 big reasons. First, it became early proof that semiconductor success was not only about invention. It was about manufacturing. Fairchild wasn't just a chip company. It was one of the places where semiconductor production methods moved from fragile lab achievement to repeatable commercial reality. Histories of Fairchild consistently emphasize its role in advancing the manufacturing process for silicon devices and helping make integrated circuits commercially viable at scale. That's why Fairchild appears so often in semiconductor timelines, not just because clever people worked there, but because the company became a machine for translating ideas into processes and processes into products. Second, Fairchild became an incubator. Later generations would call its descendants the Fairchildren, and the name's more than a bit of Valley folklore with a wink attached. It reflects a real pattern. People learned at Fairchild, spotted openings, left with colleagues they trusted, and built the next wave of companies. The Computer History Museum explicitly describes Fairchild's descendants as a kind of family tree central to Silicon Valley's identity. Intel is the most famous branch of that tree. In 1968, Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce left Fairchild and founded Intel. But Intel was only one example in a much broader pattern of spin-offs that helped define the region's entrepreneurial culture. That point often gets lost when the story is reduced to genius in a lab. Early Silicon Valley was intensely networked. It was built from small teams, overlapping friendships, rivalries, investors, recruiters, and technical reputations that traveled quickly. PBS's historical treatment of the Traitorous Eight story emphasizes how quickly the group went from deciding to leave to securing a deal, precisely because they had the right relationships and the right credibility at the right moment. In other words, the Valley's early startup culture was not random chaos. It was clustered trust. That also helps explain something culturally important. In the Valley that followed, a spin-off was not necessarily an insult. It became a pattern, almost a rite of passage. You learned in one place, saw a gap, left with a few colleagues, and started the next thing. What might look from the outside like instability or disloyalty often functioned inside the Valley as a normal mechanism of growth. The Traitorous Eight story helped normalize that pattern. Leaving wasn't always treated as betrayal. Increasingly, it was treated as how progress happened. If you go looking for the origin of Silicon Valley, this is one of the places where the trail grows warm, not because one company invented everything, but because this particular story shows the Valley's model coming into focus. It isn't just a technology story. It's a migration story, talent moving in clusters, capital following trusted operators, and a business culture emerging in which the next company is often born out of the last one. The myth makes it sound like treason. The history makes it look more like reproduction. After Fairchild and the density of relationships, the spin-offs, the sense that early Silicon Valley was less a place than a fast-moving web of people, Gordon Moore did something that seemed modest in the moment and world-shaping in hindsight. He wrote down an extrapolation. It wasn't some mystical law or a prophecy delivered from some mountaintop of silicon wafers. It was an observation, backed by a graph, with a forecast attached. In his April 19, 1965 electronics article, Cramming More Components onto Integrated Circuits, Moore looked at the recent rise in component density on integrated circuits and projected that trend forward for perhaps the next 10 years. That public date is significant because it anchors the idea to a specific document and a specific moment. Moore's law did not begin as folklore. It began as ink on paper. The forecast itself was deceptively simple. The number of components that could be economically packed onto an integrated circuit would keep rising rapidly. In the original 1965 formulation, the commonly cited cadence for that early window was about a doubling every year. Moore wasn't yet offering the later, simplified every 2 years version most people now repeat. That later cadence came after more data, more manufacturing experience, and Moore's own revision of the slope. Intel's historical summary and the Computer History Museum both make this distinction clear. The original paper projected annual doubling for the coming decade, while the later refinement came in 1975. What makes the 1965 piece so powerful is its tone. It doesn't read like science fiction. It reads like an engineer doing trend math under deadline pressure. The Computer History Museum's summary captures the move exactly. Moore examined the recent trajectory of integrated circuits, projected it forward, and described a rapid rate of increase in complexity at minimum cost. The point was not that the future would be magical. The point was that the curve looked like this, and here is where it might go next. That's the moment when an internal engineering intuition becomes something larger, a shared industry narrative. Once published, The forecast stopped being just Moore's private understanding of where integrated circuits were heading. It became a thing other people could quote, challenge, organize around, and try to beat. The Computer History Museum explicitly notes that Moore's forecast became a yardstick for progress, and Intel describes it as a guiding principle that shaped semiconductor planning for decades. A prediction like this does not just describe the future. It changes behavior in the present. Engineers hear it as a technical dare. If the curve says doubling, then feature sizes have to shrink, layouts have to improve, yields have to rise, and process tricks have to get better. Managers hear it as a scheduling rhythm. This is the release tempo, the pace the organization has to support. Investors hear it as a growth story with a clock attached. Competitors hear it as a survival warning. If you fall off the curve, you aren't just behind. You may be irrelevant. The Computer History Museum goes so far as to call out the self-fulfilling aspect directly. Moore's prediction mattered not only because it was insightful, but because it helped create expectations the industry then pushed itself to meet. That's why it's slightly misleading to talk about Moore's law as though it were a law of physics. Moore's original framing was tied not simply to density for its own sake, but to economics. More components on a chip at the point of minimum cost per component. He wasn't saying, pack more transistors on because destiny demands it. He was saying that the industry was learning how to increase density in ways that also made economic sense. In practice, that made Moore's law less like a natural constant and more like a manufacturing and business metronome. Lithography, materials, tooling, design methods, testing, and supply chains all had to improve together, or the curve would break. Moore himself revisited the idea in 1975, and here the familiar modern version begins to take shape. At the IEEE International Electron Devices meeting, he argued that the slope would change. The annual doubling pace wouldn't continue indefinitely, and a more realistic expectation for the next decade was roughly doubling every 2 years. He also pointed to the practical drivers behind continued progress, such as larger die sizes, lower defect densities, finer minimum dimensions, and what he called circuit and device cleverness. In other words, the law was already being recalibrated not as mythology, but as engineering reality. So the predictable cadence became a moving target, but the expectation of exponential improvement remained. That expectation is the part that truly reshaped modern life. Once the industry internalized the assumption that the next generation of hardware would arrive on a reliable timetable with dramatically better capability, everything else started building on top of that assumption. Software expectations, consumer product cycles, manufacturing plans, and eventually national economic strategies were all impact. The headache embedded in Moore's law isn't just technical. It's cultural. Once people believe the curve will keep climbing, they begin designing whole systems that quietly depend on it. That may be the deepest reason Moore's extrapolation became so important. It wasn't only a forecast about chips. It became a discipline for an industry and downstream, a habit of expectation for the modern world. In April 1965, Gordon Moore published Cramming More Components onto Integrated Circuits in Electronics, and with that article, a private engineering intuition became a public benchmark. The piece is often remembered as the birth of Moore's Law, but that later label can make the original article sound more mystical than it really was. What Moore actually did was simpler, and in some ways more powerful. He looked at the recent trend line for integrated circuits and projected it forward. He argued that the complexity of circuits at minimum cost had been rising at about a factor of 2 per year, and that there was good reason to expect the pattern to continue for at least the next decade. That phrase, at minimum cost, is one of the most important parts of the whole argument, and it's often flattened out when people repeat the slogan version. Moore was not talking about transistor counts in the abstract, as though density alone were destiny. He was framing the issue as economics plus engineering. In the article, he explains that as more components are packed onto a chip, the cost per component initially falls, but at some point yield losses and complexity begin to push costs back up. The key question then isn't just how many can fit, but how many can fit at a cost the market will accept? That's a very different mindset from prophecy. It's manufacturing logic. which is why the article matters so much. Moore wasn't announcing a natural law hidden inside silicon. He was describing an industrial problem with an economic curve attached. His forecast only made sense if better lithography, higher yields, smarter layout, and tighter process control kept moving together. Intel's historical summary still frames the idea in those practical terms. Moore's law was not just about more transistors, but about the industry's ability to deliver improved capability at the right cost. The second thing people often forget is how ambitious and strangely specific Moore's future applications sounded in 1965. He didn't just wave vaguely toward better electronics someday. He named things. In the opening section of the article, he predicted home computers, or at least terminals connected to a central computer, automatic controls for automobiles, and personal portable communications equipment. He even remarked that an electronic wristwatch needed only a display to be feasible. To a modern reader, those lines feel almost eerie, not because they are magical, but because they're concrete enough to sound real. They're not dreams in a vacuum. They're plausible extensions of a manufacturing trend. That specificity is part of what gave the article such lasting force. If Moore had written only in broad, airy language about a more electronic future, the piece might have faded into the background noise of optimistic 1960s technology writing. Instead, he gave readers a map with recognizable landmarks. Once those landmarks were on paper, the forecast became something people could point to, measure against, and build toward. The Computer History Museum notes that Moore's prediction became influential not only because it was perceptive, but because it gave the semiconductor industry a shared expectation, a future tense with deadlines. That is the deeper reason this was more than a prediction. It was industrial choreography. Once a target is published clearly enough, different groups begin hearing it in their own language. Engineers hear a challenge. If the curve says doubling, then we need smaller features, higher yields, better materials, and smarter design automation. Managers hear a production rhythm. This is the tempo at which product generations should arrive. Suppliers hear demand signals for tools, chemicals, masks, and manufacturing equipment. Investors hear a growth story with a clock attached. Competitors hear a warning that falling off the curve could mean irrelevance. The article does not order any of those reactions outright, but it makes them possible by giving the whole ecosystem a common metronome. That's why Moore's law became oddly self-reinforcing. The Computer History Museum explicitly describes its self-fulfilling dimension. The forecast proved influential partly because the industry began organizing itself to keep meeting it. In other words, the article didn't just predict a pattern. It helped create the pressure to sustain one. The law worked, in part, because enough people treated it as a planning discipline rather than a spectator sport. Moore himself seems to have understood the tension built into that kind of forecast. It was speculative. He was extrapolating. He couldn't know in 1965 exactly how far the curve would hold or what bottlenecks would emerge. But the usefulness of the forecast came from its clarity. It gave the industry something concrete to rally around even while everyone understood, at least in principle, that the future was not guaranteed. That combination of uncertain, but at the same time still clear, is often what makes a forecast powerful enough to shape behavior. The lasting importance of the 1965 article isn't only that Moore was right enough to become famous. It's that he turned a messy technological trend into a shared industrial story, a thing people could quote, argue over, plan around, and chase. Once that happened, Moore's law stopped being just an observation about integrated circuits and became a kind of countdown timer for modern life. By 1968, the old Fairchild energy, the sense that a small, fast-moving group could invent the future before lunch and ship it by dinner, was getting harder to sustain. Fairchild had been one of the great seedbeds of Silicon Valley, but success brought its own drag, such as bigger management structures, more internal politics, and the creeping realization that decisions once made in a hallway now had to survive committees. In a later oral history, Gordon Moore described Fairchild as going through a top management transition in which Robert Noyce, the obvious internal candidate for leadership, was being passed over. Moore recalled that when he learned Noyce was leaving, he told him, in effect, that he would come too. That is one of the key turns in Silicon Valley history. Moore and Noyce didn't simply leave a company. They helped normalize a pattern the Valley would later treat almost as civic ritual. A person sees the institution hardening, leaves, and starts over. Intel's own history places that pivot in 1968, when Noyce and Moore founded a new venture that first appeared on the paperwork as NM Electronics, then quickly became Intel, short for Integrated Electronics. Intel's official timeline and company history both preserve the naming story, including the practical detail that they had to buy the rights to the name because Intelco already existed as a hotel chain. Even in the birth of a technology giant, there was paperwork, inconvenience, and someone else already using the good name. History can be wonderfully rude that way. What often gets lost in the legend is how lean the founding logic really was. In the Joint Computer History Museum Oral History with Arthur Rock, Rock says the famous startup proposal wasn't a glossy modern business plan artifact at all. It was, in his telling, 3 pages double-spaced because some investors wanted something to put in their files. Moore then adds a revealing line: the only business plan was the one Arthur wrote. That isn't just a funny anecdote about a simpler time. It tells you a great deal about how early venture financing in tech actually worked. Investors were backing people, not admiring slide design. Arthur Rock's own recollection makes that brutally clear. When Bob Noyce called, Rock remembered the conversation as almost absurdly short. He asked how much money they needed, heard $2.5 million, asked how much the founders would invest, heard $250,000, and then worked out the rest. Rock said it was settled in 10 or 15 minutes, and Moore called it the easiest financing of a startup he thought had ever occurred in Silicon Valley. That's early venture capital in one clean snapshot. It wasn't sell me a thick plan, but instead it was I know what these people have already done, and I'm betting they can do it again. Rock was not really buying paperwork. He was buying execution capacity. The financing structure also fits that era perfectly. Intel's founding is commonly summarized as being backed by $2.5 million arranged by Arthur Rock, and later company and legal history accounts describe that money as raised through convertible debentures, essentially debt that could later convert into equity. In the oral history, Rock refers to a later convertible debenture round as part of Intel's scaling, while broader Intel histories and outside summaries consistently identify the founding financing as a $2.5 million startup package arranged by Rock. The structure reflects the classic early Valley instinct: move quickly, preserve flexibility, and align incentives without overfreezing the company too early. So what exactly was Intel betting on? Not a one-time miracle product or a single brilliant invention that would save the company if everything else went wrong. Moore's own recollections point to something harsher and more durable: semiconductor memory, built through manufacturing competence. In that same oral history, he says he'd seen the first opportunity I'd seen in years, big enough to justify a new company, and that opportunity was semiconductor memory. He explains the logic in practical terms. Memory was universal in digital systems, and Intel wanted to move toward more complex circuits where the leverage shifted back toward processing the silicon rather than labor-intensive assembly. That's not the language of a lab fantasy. It's the language of a manufacturing strategy. That distinction highlights how semiconductors punish romance. In this industry, ideas are cheap. Wafers are expensive. The phrase, "works in the lab," often only means you've discovered how far you still are from a real business. Moore's accounts repeatedly return to the same theme: build capability, make the process work, scale up, improve, repeat. He describes Intel's first steps after incorporation not as branding exercises or philosophical debates, but as hiring rapidly to reach critical mass and get products out. He also frames Intel's early technology choices with what he later called a Goldilocks strategy: one approach too easy to defend, one too hard to commercialize in time, and one just difficult enough to create a real competitive advantage. That's the engineer's version of strategic humility. You don't win by admiring your own cleverness. You win by choosing a path you can actually manufacture before your cash runs out. The founding of Intel is important not just because it created a famous company, but because it captured the Valley's maturing formula in miniature. Talented people leaving a successful but thickening institution, trusted capital moving toward them quickly, and a new firm organized not around hype, but around the ability to build advanced semiconductors reliably and repeatedly. That's the less glamorous truth underneath the legend. Moore and Noyce didn't just start over because they were visionaries. They started over because they believed they could execute faster, cleaner, and with fewer internal frictions than the company they had just left. In Silicon Valley, that belief would become contagious. When Intel is born, it isn't born as just an idea. It's born as a manufacturing promise. That's a dangerous kind of promise, because in semiconductors you aren't only competing against other firms. You're recompeting against physics, contamination, defect density, and the stubborn reality that every improvement has to survive the factory floor. And physics, as it turns out, isn't known for accepting late homework. That's part of what makes Gordon Moore's 1975 revisit to his famous forecast so revealing. By then, the world was already beginning to treat Moore's law like prophecy. Moore responded in the least prophetic way possible. He updated the chart. The talk was titled Progress in Digital Integrated Electronics, presented at the IEEE International Electron Devices meeting in 1975 and published in the conference's Technical Digest. In it, Moore didn't preach from the pulpit about destiny. He revisited the earlier trend, acknowledged that the original annual doubling described a young technology in a steep early climb, and then sketched a more sustainable longer-run trajectory, what later summaries would condense into doubling about every 2 years. Intel's own historical materials and the 1975 talk itself both point to this as the moment the cadence is revised. The talk shows how Moore thinks. He doesn't treat scaling like magic. He treats it like weather, measurable, pattern-based, and constrained. In the 1975 paper, Moore anchors the whole discussion in empirical trends. He looks at how integrated circuit complexity has grown, how die area has increased, how cost per function has fallen, and how those shifts interact. The tone isn't, "the future will obey me." The tone is closer to, "here is what the data has been doing. Here is what might plausibly happen next if several practical constraints continue to move in the right direction." Those constraints are exactly the opposite of mystical. They are things like how tightly devices can be packed, how large a chip can become before yield and cost start punishing you, how much defect density can be reduced, how small the minimum dimensions can get, and how much improvement can still come from what Moore called circuit and device cleverness. That's the real mind behind the slogan. Moore writes like a person describing a system with knobs, limits, and trade-offs. He isn't saying the industry will keep improving because improvement is morally deserved. He's saying improvement can continue if enough difficult variables keep being managed simultaneously. This means Moore's law, in practice, was never just about transistor density. It was about the whole manufacturing stack staying in tune at once: lithography, materials, process control, design methods, testing, and economics. Intel's own Moore's Law history explicitly notes that the law wasn't a force of nature, but an operating principle and commitment. And the Computer History Museum similarly describes it as an observation that became a guiding yardstick for the industry. That's why Intel's origin as a manufacturing promise is so significant. The company was not built on the assumption that one brilliant idea would carry everything. It was built on the assumption that repeated execution would. Moore's 1975 talk fits that worldview perfectly. It's the document of someone who believes progress comes not from mythology, but from repeatedly solving hard, practical problems before the previous generation of problems buries you. That's a very different kind of visionary. Not the kind who says, "Trust the future." Instead, it's the kind who says, "Here are the constraints. Now, let's see how long we can keep beating them." After 1975, Moore's Law stops being just an observation somebody cites at cocktail parties. It becomes a shared industrial rhythm. Research agendas start to align around it. Capital equipment cycles start to assume it. Product planning calendars quietly absorb it. Hiring plans begin to reflect it. And somewhere inside every serious chip team lurks the same grim internal question. Are we still on the curve? That's the hidden cultural shift. The curve becomes not just a graph, but a deadline. The industry begins behaving as though missing the timetable is not merely disappointing, but existential. If your process technology slips, or your yields don't improve, or your minimum dimensions stop shrinking of your defect control lags, then you're not simply behind on a project, you're drifting out of sync with the beat the whole industry is marching to. The Computer History Museum explicitly notes that the prediction proved influential partly because it helped set the timetable engineers then worked to meet. Moore's 1975 paper makes clear that this timetable was built from practical constraints, not magic. That's why 1975 such importance if you are writing Moore as a character in technology history. It isn't merely the year he changed the interval. It's the year you can hear his operating system clearly. Not believe, not declare, not promise. Measure, predict, adjust, repeat. That, more than any slogan, is what helped turn a trend line into an industry's planning culture. Once that planning culture took hold, the consequences reached far beyond semiconductors. Software roadmaps, consumer expectations, infrastructure investment, and whole business models began quietly assuming that hardware would keep getting dramatically better on schedule. The forecast became an operating assumption for modern life. Britannica gives the clean, almost resume-like progression of Gordon Moore's formal leadership at Intel, vice president from 1968 to 1975, president from 1975 to 1979, chief executive officer from 1975 to 1987, and chairman from 1979 to 1997. Intel's own memorial summary uses a closely related sequence of executive vice president, then chairman and CEO, then chairman, which confirms the long arc even if different summaries compress the earliest titles slightly differently. The overlaps are the interesting part. President and CEO overlap. CEO and chairman overlap. That isn't a clerical error. It's a clue about the company and the era. Early Intel was not yet the kind of mature corporation people imagine today, with sharply separated boxes for vision, operations, and board oversight. It was still a founder-driven semiconductor company trying to scale in a brutal industry, and the leadership structure reflects that. Governance and execution were braided together because continuity mattered more than tidy theory. Intel's own historical framing suggests exactly that kind of continuity, with Moore remaining central through multiple stages of the company's growth, not as a symbolic founder on the wall, but as an operating leader during the years when the company was still becoming itself. That's significant biographically because it tells you what Intel seems to have believed it needed from him: stability in motion. In semiconductors, continuity is not sentimental. It is operational. Product cycles, fab investments, process transitions, and strategic pivots take years, and a company can be badly damaged if leadership fractures while the technology roadmap is still half-built. Moore's long run across overlapping roles suggests Intel saw him less as a ceremonial founder than as a person whose presence reduced uncertainty while the company grew into a major industrial power. The semiconductor origin story loves archetypes and more often gets cast as the quiet figure standing between two louder legends. William Shockley is the brilliant troublemaker, Nobel-winning, foundational, and notoriously hard to work for. Robert Noyce is frequently remembered as the charismatic organizer, the persuasive mayor type who could make engineers, investors, and customers feel as though they were participating in the same future. Moore, by contrast, tends to emerge from the historical record as the one speaking in shorter lines, with less myth and more mechanism. That contrast is visible in his Computer History Museum oral history, where he repeatedly explains events in terms of what worked, what failed, what the constraints were, and what came next. The tone is practical and almost understated. It reads less like legend building than troubleshooting with memory. That style is part of why he can seem less vivid in popular retellings than Noyce or Shockley. He isn't trying to win the room with a speech. He's trying to make the next decision easier. In the oral history, He comes across as someone whose instinct is to break big narratives back down into processes, experiments, mistakes, and adjustments. That doesn't make him less ambitious. It makes him less theatrical. If you want one line that captures that public persona, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation almost hands it to you. In Moore's essay, The Accidental Entrepreneur, he wrote, "My career as an entrepreneur happened quite by accident." The Foundation's memorial material highlights the same self-description, noting that he may have called it accidental even if the results were anything but. That sentence is modest in the way engineers sometimes are when they are also very competitive and very good. Accident doesn't mean he tripped and accidentally founded Intel. It means something narrower and more revealing. He didn't start with a self-mythology of being a born entrepreneur. He started as a scientist and engineer following the work, from Shockley to Fairchild to Intel, making choices that, in his own mind, were practical responses to the conditions in front of him. The through line isn't, "I always wanted to start companies." It's closer to, "This is where the technical and organizational problem led next." That's why the accident line is more interesting than it first appears. It reveals a bias towards systems over self-dramatization. Moore tends to downplay the heroic founder narrative and emphasize the chain of decisions, the team, the manufacturing realities, and the execution burden. Intel's memorial framing does much the same. It doesn't present him as a flashy futurist or cult of personality CEO. It presents him as a leader whose technical judgment and forecasting discipline shaped how the company and much of the industry planned its future. When you think of Gordon Moore as a character in technology history, the useful contrast is not quiet versus charismatic as a matter of temperament alone. It's mythic founder culture versus process-minded leadership. Shockley dramatized brilliance. Noyce embodied social and strategic fluency. Moore, more often than not, sounds like the person asking what the data says, what the factory can support, and what decision keeps the whole machine moving. That's less cinematic, but probably closer to why Intel trusted him with continuity for so long. The popular Moore story often gets told that he predicted the future, and the future obeyed. While that may sound flattering, it is also backwards. Moore didn't cast a spell over silicon. He helped build, and then lead from inside, an environment where measurement, planning, capital spending, manufacturing discipline, and relentless execution made the trend line hard to escape. Over time, Moore's law stopped being just an observation and became a target, then a roadmap, then a cultural expectation. Intel's own historical framing says the 1965 projection and the 1975 revision became a guiding principle for the semiconductor industry, while the Computer History Museum notes that the prediction became influential partly because the industry organized itself to keep meeting it. That's why it's misleading to talk about Moore's law as though it were gravity, inevitable until the universe runs out of universe. Moore didn't present it that way. His original 1965 article projected the trend for perhaps the next 10 years, which is the language of a bounded forecast, not a cosmic commandment. Later retrospectives, including IEEE Spectrum, have emphasized that the article is often remembered as a simple doubling rule, even though it also included specific application forecasts and an implicit challenge to the industry to keep pushing. A more honest description is probably that Moore's law became a self-reinforcing planning target. It shaped investment, supplier roadmaps, hiring, and product expectations. That isn't physics. That's coordination. And coordination can be extraordinarily powerful, right up until people forget it's coordination and start treating it like destiny. The Computer History Museum's own summaries make exactly that point. The law mattered not just because it described progress, but because it helped set the timetable engineers and firms then tried to hit. Moore's own background helps explain why he saw the problem that way. He was trained in chemistry and physical chemistry, and that shows up in how he talked about semiconductors, process choices, manufacturability, defect control, economics, what to build in-house, what to buy, and how fast you can scale without fooling yourself. That is less glamorous than the lone inventor's story, but much closer to how semiconductors actually conquer the world. By making the impossible repeatable. After Moore stepped back from Intel's day-to-day corporate leadership, his story did not fade out so much as change venues. The same core instincts, measure outcomes, build durable institutions, think in systems, and aim for scale without losing rigor show up in his governance and philanthropy. Caltech's tribute notes that Moore became a trustee in 1983 and served as chair of Caltech's board from 1993 to 2000. That isn't a ceremonial footnote. At a research university, board leadership is where strategy, stewardship, institutional priorities, and major scientific commitments are shaped. The timing is revealing. Moore wasn't taking on something to do in retirement. He was taking on serious governance in the same decade he and Betty Moore became major science philanthropists. In 2000, they established the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. The foundation states its mission plainly: advancing scientific discovery, environmental conservation, and the special character of the San Francisco Bay Area. The biographical consistency is striking. The foundation's public materials emphasize a strategic, outcomes-driven style of philanthropy, focus on a limited number of important issues, work at a scale where significant impact is possible, and measure results rather than confuse activity with achievement. One of the foundation's own statements says it is an outcomes-driven organization that takes a scientific approach and measures results. That's basically Moore's lifelong operating habit translated into charitable work. Pick a problem where progress can be demonstrated, fund the enabling work, and keep your eye on what actually changes. So the real Moore story is not that a man made a prediction and history politely complied. It's that a very disciplined, very practical engineer helped build a culture where forecasting became coordination, coordination became expectation, and expectation became one of the operating rhythms of the modern world. Then, after CHIPS, he carried the same habit of mind into institutions and philanthropy. Not hype, not mystique, but structured bets on problems that could be measured, managed, and moved. If Silicon Valley runs on roadmaps, Gordon Moore eventually helped apply a similar logic to giving, not spray and pray, but something closer to plan, test, iterate, measure. That continuity is one of the most revealing things about his life. The venue changed from fabs and boardrooms to universities and philanthropy, but the operating style stayed recognizably Moore-like: set a target, define constraints, build institutions that can execute, and keep asking whether the results justify the effort. The Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation explicitly describes its work as outcomes-driven, emphasizing evidence, strategy, and measurable impact rather than good intentions alone. Intel and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation announced that Gordon Moore died on March 24, 2023, at age 94. Intel's release says he died in Waimea, Hawaii, while the Foundation's companion statement says he died peacefully at his home in Hawaii, surrounded by family. Moore's legacy really does move in phases. The first phase is industry insider and builder. This is the Gordon Moore of Shockley, Fairchild, and Intel, the person for whom success meant not abstract brilliance, but the ability to ship reliable devices and scale manufacturing in one of the hardest industries on Earth. Intel's obituary foregrounds exactly that arc, presenting him first as the co-founder who set the course for the future of the semiconductor industry. The second phase is the law era, when his 1965 forecast stopped being just a technical extrapolation and became a cultural artifact, part roadmap, part KPI, part shorthand for technology keeps getting better. Intel's Moore's Law press materials note that his original 1965 article projected a doubling every year for the coming decade, and that in 1975 he revised the cadence to about every 2 years. Intel also says this extrapolation became a guiding principle for the semiconductor industry for decades. The Computer History Museum makes the same basic point in stronger cultural language. Moore's prediction mattered not only because it was insightful, but because it set expectations and became partly self-fulfilling. The third phase is philanthropy and institutional legacy. By then, Moore was no longer only a semiconductor figure. He had become a major force in scientific discovery, environmental conservation, and institutional stewardship. The Moore Foundation describes those as its core focus areas, and Caltech's tribute notes his long service as a trustee beginning in 1983 and as chair of Caltech's board from 1993 to 2000. That wasn't ornamental governance. It placed him inside the strategic machinery of a major scientific institution at the same time he and Betty Moore were becoming among the most consequential science philanthropists in the United States. What is still debated isn't whether or not Moore's impact on history was significant. It is how to interpret Moore's law today. Some people treat it as a fading empirical trend. Others treat it as a shifting target that has changed form as transistor scaling has become harder. Others use it more broadly as a metaphor for expected progress in computing. But even the endless "is Moore's law dead?" arguments prove the deeper point. The industry still uses Moore's framing as its default language for progress. Intel's own materials still present it as the historical principle that guided chip development, and the Computer History Museum still describes it as a state of mind and planning norm rather than a mere slogan from the past. That's why Gordon Moore matters so much. He helped turn computing from something scarce, expensive, and specialized into something far closer to an abundant general resource. He didn't accomplish this by leaving behind one single invention you can isolate and say, that exact component is his, but by doing the harder work. He helped build the companies that scaled semiconductors. He articulated a forecast that became an organizing principle. And he treated progress as something you plan, manufacture, revise, and measure, rather than something that simply happens. Intel's obituary, Intel's Moore's Law history, and the Computer History Museum all converge on that picture, Moore as a builder, forecaster, and planner more than a showman or mystic. If history sometimes over-rewards the loudest voice in the room, Moore is a useful counterexample. His most famous contribution was, in one sense, just a calm line on a chart. But the real achievement was larger and harder. Helping make that line feel achievable, first to engineers, then to companies, then finally to an entire industry that organized itself around the expectation that progress should be measurable, scheduled, and real. That's why Gordon Moore remains such a quietly monumental figure in the history of modern technology. Not because he shouted the loudest or made himself the center of the story. Because he helped create a world in which the story could keep moving, faster, smaller, cheaper, more powerful year after year, generation after generation, chip after chip. Yet, behind all the mythology, behind all the slogans, behind all the charts repeated in boardrooms and laboratories and classrooms, there remains the simpler, steadier image. A chemist from Northern California, looking at the data, seeing the pattern, drawing the line, and challenging the world to keep up. That's it for this week's episode of Insights into History. Next week, we'll take a look at a Hollywood starlet who was instrumental in shaping today's digital communications revolution. If you have feedback, suggestions, or stories you think deserve a deeper look, email us at comments@insightsintothings.com. Again, that's comments@insightsintothings.com. Or give us a call at 856-403-8788. That's 856-403-8788. Leave a voice message, and we'll even include your message in a future show if you'd like. Again, that number is 856-403-8788. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next episode.